My name is Holub. I'm a professor at the University of Warwick, and I'm a plant geneticist. I study disease resistance of plants, how plants actually protect themselves against pathogens, primarily fungi and bacteria and viruses. And we use genetics to actually try and understand the mechanisms of disease resistance. So it's an effort to try and identify the genes that actually provide the protection, what plants actually do to defend themselves, much like human beings and our immune system, but plants have their own way of doing it.
So that's got sort of real-world consequences, obviously. Could you tell us what some of that could be or potentially be?
Well, ideally, if you know what the genes are, you might imagine putting it into a crop. If you have an example that has potential to control an important disease, then obviously you'd want to make use of it through traditional means such as plant breeding or possibly through GM technology.
And will that have any potential implication on cost or, sort of chemical spraying or whatever?
Well, the general idea is that if you can let the plant control its own diseases, then chemical control is actually going to be much less required, potentially, and so you save on the cost of applying chemicals.
And how viable and successful is it?
It's an ongoing process because many of the pathogens are able to overcome, whether it's a chemical or a disease resistance gene, there's always the potential that the pathogen can evolve, adapt, and overcome that resistance. So it involves understanding what the pathogen does, what's the makeup of the pathogen that allows it to make those changes, and knowing more about that, you can potentially anticipate the weaknesses and come up with better solutions. Much of this, plants have been doing this all along, and the question really is how do you find those ingredients in the pathogen and in the host that are most important.
So what do you think the major challenges are for plant scientists in the next 10 years?
I think the major challenge is actually taking a lesson from medical science. This big push that's going on at the moment of being able to sequence genomes, a lot of it's led by human medical science. And the basic science in humans is being turned into a huge investment in trying to come up with better solutions for medicine. The challenge for plant biology is to do that as well with much less money. We know food is important. The most important fuel, biofuel, is actually the food we eat. And if we can solve food production, it's benefiting ourselves as well as developing countries where food is the major issue, no matter how you look at life.
You're using the term biofuel not as in fuel for vehicles, but as food for humans.
Yeah, it's a twist on the word. We know biofuel has a very specific meaning in the press these days relating to the ability to run cars and vehicles. But when you think about the biology, everything on this planet is really dependent on plants. And the biofuel that keeps our personal engines going is what allows us to drive a car. So we need to be able to address those important issues for crop production.
Thinking of the UK specifically, how do you think the plant science community here should structure itself, to sort of meet challenges and deliver sort of results as you've outlined? Well,
the structure is in place. I think it's more of the same. It's important that we carry on doing the sort of science that we do on all the aspects that various people do in their very special interests in the approaches they use. But organizing the science and finding the good examples and promoting it is a very important thing. And that's really just to try and keep in the game of acquiring research funding and meeting the taxpayers' requirements and our own, because we are taxpayers as well. So.
Sure, okay. Maybe you'll agree that new technologies are lowering the barriers to studying agriculturally and commercially important crops. What role do you think, if any, that the model plant Arabidopsis has in the future of plant science?
I think there's specific examples in the area of, say, disease resistance. Many of the genes that were discovered a decade ago are very specific, and they have a very limited use, perhaps, in crop protection. But as we explore something like Arabidopsis more, just by changing the pathogens that we use to do our experiments, we're starting to uncover genes that actually potentially have a wider spectrum of use. And those genes, some of them relate to things that were discovered before, so we're learning new things about other versions of the same thing. But there are new genes being discovered as well. And there is a continuing groundswell of knowledge that's coming, and part of our challenge is to choose the examples that are going to have the best impact and find the best way to get them into actual use. A personal example is a gene from Arabidopsis, which we've identified using a cabbage pathogen. And that gene has potential use in oilseed crops. And the disease that it actually relates to is most important as a disease in India. So at the moment, we're trying to find partnerships in India where they're looking to actually use a gene that might be in a GM crop as one tool, but it also, if we get a partnership going, we begin to help actually work with them in the crop itself and find equivalent genes and put the combination of the genes together for the disease control. So these are partnerships. My science is starting to open up as I look for these extended partnerships overseas.
Interesting. And last question, just changing tack slightly, is do you think botany is important to plant science today?
I think absolutely, yeah. My enthusiasm for plants has come out of an interest in plants as a botanical subject. Being able to identify things is very important. Knowing things in your environment is very important. Arabidopsis itself, we tend to think of as a plant in the laboratory, but it's a wildflower around the UK. And if you start looking at it as a botanical interest, it actually opens up questions that you might not be thinking about while you're in the laboratory. And you think about those things when you're out appreciating the plants in the wild. And that really is a botanical sort of training and discipline, being aware of your environment and how plants fit in them. Arabidopsis, as small as it is one of those examples.